Okay, good evening, everyone. Okay, everyone on Zoom, can you hear me? Can someone give me like a thumbs up or something if you can hear me? There's like a thumbs up symbol.
Can hear you. I can hear you.
Perfect. Thanks, Betty. Okay, here we go. We're also trying out a new stand for the iPad. It's a little bit of a different angle than in the past. I hope it works. But let's get right into it. As always, we'll start with just a logistical announcement. We just announced a batch of 3 final shiurim. We're going to finish this series, Be'ez Hashem, before Rosh Hashanah, of course. And there are floating times. Just be aware of that because of all the other programming and shiurim that we have over the course of Elul. The times are not going to be static. It's going to be floating from week to week. Just pay attention to the announcements, and Be'ez Hashem will be able to continue our limud until we finish our study of ethics of our fighters. So tonight we begin part 3 of the book, which is about preventative and preemptive wars, Israeli warfare from 1956 to 1980. What we are going to examine is 5 case studies, and we will actually add a 6th. There are 5 case studies in the book of preemptive wars, instances where Israel either elected or elected not to launch a preemptive war, the ethical ramifications of it as it emerges from the sources and as it applies to those various case studies. And again, just some broad sweeping conclusions about the tricky ethical issues about preemptive wars. So what are the 6 case studies that we are going to look at? First, we're going to look at the 1956 Sinai campaign. That was Israel's first major military engagement after the Milchemet Ha'atzmaut, after the War of Independence. Of course, as we'll discuss, there were skirmishes that were happening between 1948 and 1956. That was the first major campaign that they did when, with the approval of the British and the French, Israel effectively invaded the Sinai Peninsula and was very successful in taking Sinai from Egypt. Ultimately, it gave it back after the campaign ended. That was number 1. Next, 1967, 11 years later, was, of course, the Six-Day War, which Rabbi Brody identifies on page 196 as, quote, the classic case study in international law of an anticipatory self-defense attack. Of course, again, very famously, the writing was on the wall. It was very clear that Israel was going to be invaded by its neighbors, and it launched an astonishingly successful preemptive strike, destroyed effectively the entire Egyptian Air Force while it was still grounded, while it was on the ground, and had an astonishing victory in just 6 days over its enemies, probably the most remarkable victory that Israel had in its history. 6 years later was the Yom Kippur War. Of course, the Yom Kippur War, Israel did not launch a preemptive strike. There was discussion of launching a preemptive strike, but they elected not to. And that war was markedly different from the Six-Day War just 6 years earlier. That was a war when ultimately Israel did have a quite resounding victory. By the numbers, in some ways, it was an even more resounding victory than 1967, but it came with much anxiety and moments of existential peril when people feared that Israel was going to be wiped off the map. And of course, they feared for what the invading armies would do with the Jewish population that was in the state of Israel. So that was the Yom Kippur War in 1973. In 1981, there was the preemptive strike on Saddam's Osirak reactor. The Iraqis were building a nuclear reactor. Israel was concerned that it might lead to a nuclear weapon, and they struck the reactor proactively. We'll talk about that. That was 1981. And then 1982 was Peace for Galilee / the First Lebanon War. The PLO were launching military strikes from Lebanon, and Israel decided that they were going to eliminate the PLO as a result because of the constant terror attacks that they were launching from Israel's northern border. So those are the 5 case studies that are in the book. What is the 6th case study? The 6th case study that is not in the book, because the book was written before it transpired, is the current war in which we are engaged right now. Now, of course, in the current war, there was no preemptive strike, but there was talk of a preemptive strike on October 8th. Now, you'll say, how could there be a preemptive strike if we were already struck in the worst terror attack in Israel's history on October 7th? So there was and this has been reported widely, fellow listeners of Dan Senor will certainly be familiar with this, there was a very dramatic cabinet meeting on October 8th, where Israel had to make a decision regarding what course of action they were going to take in this war. At that meeting, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and the Ramatkal, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Herzi Halevi, called for a strike on Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, you'll ask, why Hezbollah in Lebanon if Hamas were the ones who carried out this terror attack, and Hamas were the ones who were holding captives, et cetera, and they were in Gaza, not in Lebanon. So the idea was that if a multi-front war was going to be opened, and if you recall, there was much fear in those early days of a multi-front war opening. There's still talk of that now because most Israelis actually, ironically, want a war in the north. No one wants war ever. But if the alternative is dealing with Hezbollah amassed on the northern border, most Israelis feel that it's just inevitable. It's a question of timing. It's either going to be now or later. So if we're going to go to war in the north, if there was going to be a multi-front war, the general principle of military strategy dictates that you first take on the stronger opponent before taking on the weaker opponent. You don't expend all of your resources, exhaust all your soldiers taking on a weaker opponent only to face a stronger opponent later on. You take the stronger opponent first. Let's strike Hezbollah now. We've learned over the last let's say, few weeks or last month that Israel possesses remarkable intelligence regarding Hezbollah and its operations and what's happening in Lebanon. And they said, let's strike Lebanon first. It was opposed by Bibi Netanyahu. Bibi Netanyahu is no slouch in terms of his military service. He served in Sayeret Matkal, but he was not a general the way some others were. But he brings some other people with that kind of military pedigree, if you will, with him. So he brought Benny Gantz, who was, of course, a leader of the opposition at the time, but he brought him into a unity government. And in Benny Gantz's party is a man named Gadi Eisenkot. Both of them are former heads of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, if you will. Each was a Ramatkal in his time. And they both opposed the preemptive strike on Hezbollah. What was the logic on either side? So again, the logic for Gallant, as I said before, was traditional military wisdom dictates that you take on the stronger opponent first. They also believed that with the intelligence that they had, they would be able to catch Hezbollah off guard. Hezbollah was under the impression that Israel was preoccupied with Hamas and Gaza. We will catch them off guard. We will have a preemptive strike, the likes of which have not been seen since 1967. We will fundamentally alter the character of Israel's neighborhood in the Middle East. That was the argument. What was the counter argument? The counter argument was, you are giving Hamas exactly what they want. What did Hamas want in their Al-Aqsa flood? What were they hoping for? They were hoping to open up a multi-front war where all of Iran's proxies, Iran has, and this was a strategy set by Qasem Soleimani, who Yimach Shemo, who of course now is no longer among the living thanks to a U.S. military strike. But Qasem Soleimani set up all these Iranian proxies to kind of serve as a noose around Israel. So he has Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and he has the Houthis in Yemen, and you have several militias in Syria and Iraq, etc. What Hamas wanted was to ignite a regional war. They were going to attack, and then all these other players were going to get into the war as well. Their miscalculation is that not everybody plays by their timetable. They were excited to do it. Other people were not eager to engage in a war. And as much as all these groups coordinate with each other, they do have their own narrow individual interests. And in particular, it wasn't in the interest of the greatest player in this whole saga, which is, of course, Iran, the head of the octopus, as Naftali Bennett likes to call them. They didn't want a regional war at this moment, likely because they want to build nuclear weapons before they go to a regional war. So Hamas did not get the regional war that they wanted. Argued Netanyahu, Gantz, Eisenkot, if you go to Lebanon now, you're playing right into Sinwar's hands. That's exactly what he wants. You're going to give him that multi-front war. We need to focus on Gaza. We need to focus on the hostages. Like let's take care of the business that needs to be done immediately, and we can leave Hezbollah for another time. Who was right? It's impossible to know. It's impossible to know. It could be that military strike would have been a resounding victory, not seen since 1967, fundamentally altering Israel's security in the Middle East. Could be. It could have opened up a multi-front war that would have been catastrophic for Israel. It would have indeed played exactly into what Hamas wanted. Who was right? We don't know. But it's another instance where a preemptive strike was discussed. Finally, I'll just note that I don't think this was a major preemptive strike, but there was another preemptive strike just last week. Just last week, there was a preemptive strike. There was news that Hezbollah had aimed their rockets. Again, Israel seems to have remarkable intelligence on the north. They were going to launch a barrage, a significant volley at Tel Aviv at 5 a.m. A few hours before, Israel struck what was apparently hundreds, if not thousands, of rocket launchers to make sure that the attack was minimal. They hit maybe a few chicken farms in the north. So those chickens died al Kiddush Hashem. They have a special chilek in Olam Haba, but Baruch Hashem, they were able to prevent any major casualties to actual citizens of the state of Israel. So that was a minor preemptive strike, and one that seems to have been very effective, but not the major preemptive strike that some in Israel were urging in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, that some were urging on October 8th. So What we're going to do now is we'll talk about some of the background, the Talmudic background. There's one particular passage in the Gemara that Rabbi Brody highlights that we'll talk about for a moment. And then we will look at some of the different cases. We'll break them down into categories. Rabbi Brody really does a lot of this, but I'll try to kind of elucidate it as well as I can. We'll break things down into two categories and several subcategories in order to kind of understand what some of the ethical issues are. And of course, we'll offer contemporary observations and applications as well. Talmudic background is the Gemara in Sota and Daf and Daled Amud Beis. The Gemara here is quoting on a well-known Mishnah. The Mishnah distinguishes between Milchemes Rishus and Milchemes Mitzvah. There are some wars that are commanded wars, and there are other wars that are discretionary wars. You're allowed to go to war in certain circumstances. If a king, with advice of the Sanhedrin, feels that it's appropriate to do so, you can. There are others that are just necessity, conquering the land from the 7 nations, or fighting Amalek, or wars of self-defense, the post can assume. Those are all commanded wars. The Gemara there says that if there is a Milchemes Rishus, it's actually in Yana Diyoma, it's this week's Parsha. If there's a Milchemes Rishus, if there's a discretionary war, then certain people are exempt. If you built a new house, if you planted a vineyard, if you just got married, then you go home. But if it's a commanded war, if it's a Milchemes Mitzvah, afilu kala mechupasa, the Mishnah in Sota says, even a bride who just got married, she goes straight from the chuppah to serve the Jewish people. Obviously, in whatever capacity she's capable of serving the Jewish people, doesn't mean she literally needs to pick up a rifle and go. She needs to. Everybody needs to do their part. Everybody needs to serve, says the Mishnah. Parenthetically, I will note that when I was in Israel, my last trip to Israel, I noted this on the WhatsApp group. If anyone was following, we participated in actually the planting of a vineyard in Kibbutz Kerem Shalom. Kibbutz Kerem Shalom is called Kerem Shalom, the vineyard of peace, but there was no Kerem there. There was no actual vineyard. And we were there. We were present with them when they actually planted the vineyard. And President Herzog was there at the event. He spoke. I was sitting like right behind him, and he spoke about the significance of planting a vineyard in the Torah. He says it's so significant that you're even exempted from a war. And he corrected himself. He says, "A milchemet harashut, not a milchemet mitzvah," which again was coming from the president of Israel. I don't know if Ben Gurion was sheping nachas at that moment when the president of Israel was, quoting a Mishnah and a Gemara. But remember, President Herzog, his yichus goes back to Rav Herzog. I think it was his grandfather or great-grandfather was Rav Herzog, who was, of course, a great Talmud Chacham and the early chief rabbi of Israel. So he correctly noted that. And his drush was, why are you exempt from a Milchemet Reshut when you plant a vineyard? He says, because planting a vineyard itself is the greatest contribution to Israel's war effort. When they tell us they're going to uproot us from this land, you know what we do? We put down roots. And when they tell us that we're not going to stay here, we build for the future. And we tell them that we are going to remain here. So his argument was that planting of the Kerem is not just an excuse not to serve in war. It is inherently, intrinsically part of Klal Yisrael's moral warfare, if you will, spiritual victory over its enemies. I thought that was a very nice drush from the Nasi, from the president. But the Gemara there discusses, okay, fine. So you're telling me that people are exempt from discretionary wars. They're obligated in Milchemes Mitzvah. So what is the difference between the two? What is the difference between the discretionary war and the commanded war? The Gemara begins by saying there are certain things that easily fit into one category or another. Amar Rava, the wars that Yoshua conducted to conquer the land of Israel, Hashem directly commanded that you need to do that. That's definitely a Milchemes Mitzvah. No question there. No brainer. That's easy. Milchamos based David l'Ravacha Devrei Rishus. David HaMelech undertook several wars of expansion that were never commanded in the Torah. That was clearly a discretionary war, not a commanded war. Then the Gemara says as follows. There's a machlokas about a middle case. What is the middle case? When you go to war to prevent an enemy nation from attacking you. What is the status of that war? Mar kari la mitzvah or mar kari rishus. One opinion maintains that such a war is a milchemes mitzvah, it's commanded, and the other maintains that it is a milchemes rishus, that it is only a licensed war or a discretionary war, but not a commanded war. So you already have machlokas about the status of a war that is taken preemptively or preventatively, and everybody knows those are not exactly the same thing. Preemptive is more immediate. Preventative is more for something that's more far off in the future regarding the halachic status of these wars. Of course, even within this, you have subsequent debate on the Gemara, as you always do, as to At what point do you draw the line? Let's say it's really immediate. Let's take the case of last week when Israel launched this strike against these Hezbollah rocket launchers. There were many who were calling it a preemptive strike in Israeli media. And there were others who were objecting to that label, preemptive. They were locked and loaded. They were about to fire. That's not a preemptive strike. You have to wait until the fire actually falls on your cities before you strike back. So again, to me, it seems to me that in a scenario like that, I don't know if anyone would argue that it was a Milchemes Rishos. So you end up with this subsequent debate on the Gemara itself as to where the line is in terms of determining what is preemptive and what is not. But that is why you have this somewhat ambiguous status that's recognized or enshrined already in a Talmudic debate regarding the halachic status itself. So what are some of the ethical considerations? So there are some cases that appear to be ethically clear, where there's really little ambiguity about the ethics of a preemptive strike. And these are what Rabbi Brody calls ICG cases. He outlines this on page 197 of the book, when there is imminence, credibility, and gravity. Imminence, it's about to happen. Credibility, you have a high degree of certainty about the intel that you have. It's not a guess. And number three, gravity. The ramifications of delay are grave. It's not just going to be set you back slightly from a military standpoint. If you wait, it will set you back very, very far. 1967 and 1973 both fit these three criteria. In both scenarios, Israel had intelligence that an attack was imminent, credible intelligence that an attack was imminent, and the gravity of which was potentially grave, potentially the annihilation of the state of Israel itself. The only issue, as we will see, was international opinion. Should Israel launch this preemptive strike in light of international opinion? And I will note that that's both a strategic and potential ethical issue. I will argue that the ethical issue is moot, but it's potentially, at least in theory, a strategic and ethical issue. Strategic because in the realm of diplomatic opinion, sometimes it's very important to have allies who are supporting you when you go to war, particularly the United States of America, from the perspective of the Israeli military, the Israeli government. And an ethical issue because, as we've seen, there were many who assumed that international opinion and international law was a legitimate basis for ethical considerations, for military ethical considerations. As we've argued throughout, we've noted the flaws with that, and we will note them again in a moment, but those were the two considerations. So what is the history here? So in these two instances, the government made very different decisions. And again, Rabbi Brody outlined some of the drama that happened behind those decisions. In the Six-Day War, religious ministers initially opposed taking the first shot. Religious ministers said, Jews don't take the first shot. We have to defend our country, but we don't shoot first. I never knew this before, but again, he records this in the book. Yitzhak Rabin, who was not the prime minister at the time, he was the Ramatkal. He was the highest ranking military officer in the IDF. He was urging them to launch this preemptive strike. And apparently he had a nervous breakdown for a day because he was desperately trying to convince them to do it, and the government was stalling, and he recognized the ramifications of doing so. Again, some of you may remember Rabin. I've only read about Rabin, but even though Rabin is much remembered for his peace accords, Rabin was one of the most celebrated soldiers in the history of Tzahal. And when he felt that there was a threat to Israel, he wasn't just going to sit back and naively hope for peace. He said, we need to strike now in order to actually make sure that Israel is going to survive this. And apparently he actually was incapacitated for a day because he was meeting this resistance from the government. He, in order to get support from the religious ministers, he enlisted support from Harav Shlomo Goren. He asked Rav Goren for support. Rav Goren examined the scenario and indeed lent his support to the preemptive strike. One of the major considerations that was a reservation, as we said before, was international support. He notes, again, I was unaware of any of this history before reading in this book. There was a suggestion to even send a ship through the Straits of Tiran. Remember that Nasser, who was constantly threatening to annihilate the state of Israel. This was a point in history when pan-Arabism was still a major idea and movement. There was talk about all the Arab countries uniting under a single flag. And the most likely candidate at the time to lead that pan-Arab movement was Nasser in Egypt. Throughout modern Middle Eastern history, there's been this constant competition, if you will, for which nation is going to be the leader of the Arab world and the Dar al-Islam and the world of Islam in general. So at points it was Egypt, at points it was Iraq. Of course, Saudi Arabia is a major player because they are the guardians, of course, of Islam's most sacred sites. Now, of course, a major player who was usually not a major player is Iran. Iran is a major player now. Iran, mind you, is not Arab. It's not an Arab nation, and it's also not a Sunni nation. So for several reasons, Iran, for most of modern history, was not a major player, but of course now it is. But in any event, Nasser is constantly threatening to destroy Israel. And they said, you know what? He closed the Straits of Tiran. We're going to send the ship through. We're going to force them to fire on the ship, and then we'll respond. Now, that's a remarkable suggestion, right? You are sending soldiers, essentially, I guess, if you're going to send a military ship, to their deaths, effectively, just so that you have the pretense of not having taken the first shot. Now, thankfully, that suggestion was rejected. And why was it rejected? Because the assumption was it's not going to help Israel anyway. And I think that proved to be a correct observation. Again, we'll elaborate more on that in just a moment. But ultimately, Israel does take the first strike. And of course, that was the right decision in 1967. 6 years later, there's a similar discussion happening right before the Yom Kippur War. He describes, again, a dramatic meeting between David Elazar, Moshe Dayan, Golda Meir. Elazar supports a preemptive strike. Dayan and Golda oppose, once again, largely because of fear of international isolation. That was largely, again, that might have been a legitimate fear, thanks to Secretary of State of this country, Henry Kissinger, who has a bit of a checkered record. And certainly, again, I know that there are strong opinions in different directions on Kissinger's record. He definitely did a lot of negative things in the context of the Yom Kippur War. Let's say that. Certainly in the early days, let's say. And there was a fear that they wouldn't receive U.S. weapons if they launched the preemptive strike. I'll throw in another parenthetical. I may have shared the story before. There's a story that Golda Meir was once walking with Richard Nixon, and they were flanked by their respective secretaries of state, Abba Eban and Henry Kissinger. And Nixon apparently commented to Golda, "Oh, look, we both have Jewish heads of state. We both have, Abba Eban and Henry Kissinger, both Jewish secretaries of state." And Golda, who was so sharp, apparently responded to Richard Nixon. She said, "Yes, Mr. President, but mine speaks a fluent English," is what she said. For those who know, Kissinger had a heavily accented English. Abba Eban spoke a king's English. So that was her quip back to President Nixon. But they were afraid of international opinion, and they didn't launch the strike. And again, we all know the ramifications of the Yom Kippur War and how differently that went from the Six-Day War. So look, it's never our place to judge these people who are in these situations. None of us can confidently say we would have made a better decision. But from an ethical standpoint, I think there's one very clear lesson from these, and that is that international opinion does not and really should not matter from an ethical standpoint in any of these cases. I like the quote that he had from page 199. I will open to it. If anyone has the book in front of them, you can join me on page 199. He poses the question as follows. Where am I? Hold on one second. I'm struggling to find the line that I was looking for. Oh, I'm sorry. Here it is. The section that begins with the headline, "Does the UN Charter allow for preemptive strikes, and does it matter?" That's the question that he poses. The critical questions remain whether it would have been fair for the international community to label Israel as the aggressor, and whether Israeli officials should have cared anyway. Rabbi Brody answers, the answer to both questions is no. It would not have been fair to label Israel the aggressor, and even if people would, should it matter to Israel? No, it really should not. As we've said, extensively when we were documenting the early Jews who were proponents of international law as a measure of Jewish military ethics, it's always going to be guided by political considerations. Israel will always be labeled the aggressor, no matter what Israel does, no matter how defensive its wars are. And people learned that early on, and they recognize that this is not a barometer for us of what is actual ethical behavior. I'll give you an example in my own lifetime that I really distinctly remember. And it's ironic to me that the same media pundits who were so gravely wrong in this instance are still making these same comments, same projections now. I remember in 2006, earlier than 2006, the Hit Not Kut happened in what year? 2005. When the Hit Not Kut was happening, and obviously, of course, there was a major, culturally in Israel, that was a major divide in Israeli society. But American pundits were saying, look, maybe it will bring peace. And even if it doesn't bring peace, at this point, no one can blame Israel anymore for the fight. Everyone sees clearly Israel is doing its part. They're unilaterally withdrawing. They're not getting anything in return. They are making this unilateral concession to the Palestinians. Any fair-minded person can no longer blame Israel for this conflict. I remember pundits saying that. So it's a win-win for Israel. Either it brings peace or it doesn't bring peace, but at least Israel's standing in the international community is forever salvaged because Israel took this step. And what a joke it was. What would it take? A month, 2 months for the international community to continue to condemn Israel for the rockets that were being launched from the Gaza Strip? And again, it's these same pundits nowadays suggesting Israel should, I'm not going to mention names, but Israel should do X and Israel should do Y, and then everybody will blame everything on Hamas, not on Israel. It's like a joke. How many times can you kind of like echo the same canard over and over again, hoping that maybe this time it's going to come true? There was just a clear recognition that no matter what, Israel is going to be labeled by many as the aggressor, no matter what Israel does. So using international opinion, again, as a strategic consideration, that of course might be legitimate and is subject to strategic concerns. But as an ethical issue, it cannot and should not guide Israeli decision-making in the context of preemptive strikes. So those are the first two cases, 1967 and 1973. What about scenarios where it is not as clear? The attack is not immediate, or we don't know if they plan to attack immediately, or the consequences are not as grave. It's not a potential existential threat or existential crisis for the Jewish people. What happens in those scenarios? So here there are ethical considerations. And I would say there are two in particular that are very important to undertake in the context of trying to decide a preemptive strike. Number one is unpredictability, and number two is cost-benefit analysis. When it comes to unpredictability, if you don't have knowledge of, again, that ICG threat, you know it's imminent, it's coming right away, it's potentially going to wipe us out, right? You have to wonder, is a war actually going to happen, or is it not? To go back to a great example that we discussed, but Rabbi Brody did not, that discussion that happened on October 8th. The assumption was war with Hezbollah is going to get involved, so we need to strike first, right? But we, with the benefit of hindsight, almost a year later, we know that Hezbollah, of course, did get involved every single day. They're destroying more communities in the north, but it was nothing close to the kind of full-scale invasion or incursion that was feared in the early days of the war. It was nothing like, again, Hezbollah certainly has not launched their arsenal of 100,000 rockets, including precision-guided missiles, at Israeli cities. So one question is, what will happen if we don't launch the preemptive strike? Are we definitely going to be invaded, as was the case in 67 or 73? Or might there be an alternative? That's one major ethical consideration. And the second one is cost-benefit analysis, both for your own populace and on an ethical level for the enemy populace as well. For your own populace, does the cost justify the gain? And again, it's not an existential threat. So there's going to be a cost of going to war. Does the cost justify the gain? That's one question to ask. And there's the question of proportionality, but I think proportionality is almost a dirty word nowadays because of the way it's so dramatically skewed by the media. The actual concept of proportionality from a military ethics standpoint is not the way the Western media likes to use it. The Western media likes to use proportionality saying it's a numbers game. Just count how many people died on each side, and then you could decide who's right and who's wrong. Hamas slaughtered and raped and brutalized civilians. Israel tries to engage in self-defense, but kills more people along the way. It's disproportional. That's how the Western media uses the term. That's not what it actually means from a military ethics standpoint. What it actually means is your strike proportional to the valued military gain? If I can kill one terrorist by launching a nuke and knocking out an entire city, that's not proportional because the small amount that you gain from just that one person is not proportionate to the amount of damage that you are doing. If you have an organization that is genocidal and intends to wipe out your entire people and does so on October 7th and promises to do so again and again and again, then the military action on the other side, in terms of proportionality, needs to be weighed against the importance of wiping out that military threat. So those are the things that need to be considered when it comes to preemptive wars. Let's analyze briefly both of those considerations, and then we'll take a look at three case studies of where they came into play. When it comes to unpredictability, I'll just make 3 points that, again, I think Rabbi Brody makes, and then I'll add a fourth point of my own. That have weight or bearing on Israeli military decision making. The first is that it's true, things are unpredictable. If you expect to always know exactly what's going to happen, then you're living in a dream world. You're living in a fantasy. Life is unpredictable, and war is certainly unpredictable. So when it comes to launching a preemptive strike, the first step is just accepting the nature of things, that they are unpredictable. Again, you have certain philosophers in their ivory towers and say, unless you know definitively, you can't go to war. But that's a bit of a joke. It's easy to say that in the comfort of an ivory tower. In the real world, when you're actually dealing with people's lives and defense of your country and potential existential threats, unpredictability is part of the nature of things. Right? Brody gave two test cases that highlight the opposite ethical considerations on each side of the issue. He gave one example of the Nazis, the rise of the Nazis, where the Allies decided not to launch a preemptive strike, obviously to their great detriment. Appeasement did not work in the context of World War II. But he gives a counterexample of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a great example where many were urging President Kennedy to launch a preemptive strike, which possibly could have ended in nuclear war and nuclear holocaust. And he decided not to and give diplomacy a chance, and that was ultimately successful. So you have examples where the ramifications are grave on either side, and there's no really one-size-fits-all answer to these kinds of questions. Directly following from that is he said there are cases where you're not necessarily dealing with a morally correct decision versus an incorrect decision. There are cases where it could be moral to strike and also moral to wait. In other words, there's legitimate options on either side. These are really difficult test cases. And again, as much as ethicists who sit in university halls or ivory towers like to view it as a black and white clear binary, there could be cases where, no, there's moral ambiguity here. You're licensed to do it, but you're also licensed to hold back. I will just add, and I think Rabbi Brody would agree with this, but he doesn't explicate it. In Israel's history, it's usually pretty predictable. In Israel's history, it is usually pretty predictable. Not always, but in most cases, when there's a concern of, enemies invading Israel, when they say they're going to wipe Israel off the map, usually they mean it. And it's only a question of when they're going to do it, but usually it has proven over the last 75 years to not just be saber rattling. It usually means that they have an intent to do it. That's why Israel takes the Iranian threat so seriously. And that's why people in the West perhaps don't take it as seriously. People boast or people, engage in all sorts of exaggerated talk all the time. So who says that when the mullahs profess an interest in wiping Israel off the map, they really mean it? So Jews don't have that luxury. When people say they're going to wipe us off the map, they have a history of actually meaning what they say. And we don't have the luxury of just dismissing it as hyperbole or exaggeration. So as far as things are unpredictable, that's true. And again, I gave you an example where on October 8th, there was precisely a debate over this exact issue. But if you had to measure the weight of the evidence in the context of Israeli history, it usually lends more towards our enemies being interested in war than the contrary. Cost-benefit analysis is a much more complicated question. And it really, again, also points to the complexities that many, let's say, again, analysts, journalists, academics can very easily miss. Let's go into an example from 1956, and we'll get back to this soon. Between 1948 and 1956, you have these constant raids of the Fedayeen, of these Palestinian fighters going across the border from Egypt, and they're constantly, either doing minor damage or, in case, slaughtering civilians in Israel. Now, you count the number of civilians that were killed, and I don't know what exactly the number would be. Let's say, for argument's sake, it was 1,000, let's say. And you know that going to war will cost you more than that in soldiers' lives. Let's say it will cost 1,100, again, for argument's sake. But at the same time, that war will stop the attacks and enable the residents of all of Israel's south to live with some measure of peace and security, which they cannot live with when these attacks are constantly happening. So what's the cost-benefit analysis there? If you go by strict numbers, you'd say, don't go to war. It's going to cost you more in lives than these attacks are costing. But when you consider what it means to live as a nation with a basic sense of security in life, and a basic sense that you can rely on your government to defend you, and a basic sense that you can live in your home without having to worry and wake up in the middle of the night fearing that someone with a rifle is going to come in and slaughter your children, how exactly do you assess the value there? What's the cost-benefit analysis? It's very, very difficult to assess. And you've seen that play out in Israel over the last year as well. For a long time, Israelis thought that it wasn't worth it to do a ground incursion into Gaza. They knew it was going to be costly. They thought it was going to be way more costly than it has been, Baruch Hashem, but they knew it was going to be costly. And they said, look, we'll live with this threat in our southern border, and every few years we will, what was the expression in Israel? We'll mow the grass. We'll do what we need to do in order to cut Hamas down. They'll inevitably build up, and we'll cut them down again. And we'll live with that. We'll live. It's not fun. Nobody likes it. Nobody likes the fact that everybody in Sderot and the other border communities are constantly running to bomb shelters. But it's the cost of living in this part of the world, and that's what we're going to do. Of course, after October 7th, we realized that calculation was incorrect. And that can't be the cost of doing things, because Hamas is way worse in terms of intentions and capabilities than was previously assumed. Israel's borders, both in the north and south, are currently uninhabitable. And even if a ground incursion was going to be costly, there was no choice. To use an expression that Rabbi Brody critiques, but is used frequently in Israel, it was a Mohammed ein brera. There was no choice. It had to be done. So you see these considerations playing out constantly. Now, what about the three case studies that we have to analyze that fit into this category? The first was the Iraq reactor, when they bombed Saddam's reactor in Iraq. On one level, this was the easiest choice. There was the least belligerence involved. It was going to be a few pilots dropping some bombs. It was not going to be an extended military operation. On another level, it was so on that level, it was one of the easiest moral decisions. On another level, however, it was actually one of the most difficult, because there were no plans of an imminent attack. This was really planning for far into the future, right? He didn't have a bomb yet. Even if he had a bomb, there was no clear. He didn't clearly, there was a possibility that perhaps he wouldn't use it. This wasn't like something that, it was going to happen imminently. So on that level, it was more complex. In terms of the cost-benefit analysis, on the Iraq side, there were a total of 8 casualties. It was done on a Sunday to minimize casualties. And on the Israel side, it was a quick aerial bombardment. There was no prolonged war, so the cost was minimal. The benefit was a no nuclear Iraq. So the benefit was immense, and the cost was minimal. In this instance, I think it is very clear to me that there was little moral conundrum in terms of what Israel did, and that it was absolutely right. Of course, the entire world condemned Israel for doing it, for violating Iraqi sovereign territory, and there was no immediate threat, and it was unprovoked, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they say that quietly under the table, the same diplomats who were condemning Israel and UN votes publicly were giving them yashikayach, quietly, privately, because nobody really wanted an armed nuclear Iraq under Saddam. I will note again, this is a real personal aside. There's one personal story in my own family where I must have been a teenager. So my youngest brother was probably, 9 or 10 years old. He had this like toy where he kept pressing this button, and it made the most horrifying, annoying noises you could possibly imagine. And he realized how much it was bothering everyone. So as a 9-year-old, as a 10-year-old, what did he do? He kept like doing it over and over and over again. So at one point, I got so frustrated that I took it from him and I eliminated the toy. We're not going to go into details of how exactly I did so, but I took it off the map. I eliminated it from existence. And my parents duly punished me for doing so, for taking property of my younger brother and destroying it. And I remember, clearly I was at least a somewhat intelligent teenager at the time, I remember quipping to my parents, this punishment is like the condemnation of Israel after they bombed Saddam's nuclear reactor. I said, you guys both know that you are thrilled that I actually took out this toy, and you are just like, you're going through the formalities. They both started laughing. They weren't even going to deny it. They they recognized the reality for what it was. But that's what happened with the nuclear reactor. To me, it seems clear that, again, without much ambiguity, that it was a morally correct decision. A much more ambiguous one is the 1956 Sinai campaign. So again, you had as we said before, you had these raids constantly coming over the Egyptian border, and Israel decided, in consultation with Britain and France. Britain and France were mad at Nasser for nationalizing private companies, and they supported Israel. They quietly planned together to support Israel, and Israel invaded. Now, there was a cost to Israeli lives, but the benefit was 10 years of quiet. Benefit was 10 years of quiet. Now, how does one assess that in retrospect. I think from an Israeli standpoint, it was a success. If you bought 10 years of quiet on the southern border, again, every loss of every soldier is the loss of an olam maleh, is the loss of a world. But 10 years of Israelis being able to live in peace and security is a huge achievement. I will note that the war is remembered as a dramatic failure, but more on part of Britain and France than on Israel. This war is often remembered by historians as the moment when the old powers, i.e., Britain and France, lost the mantle of global leadership to the United States. Of course, that really happened during World War II. Of course, Britain and France were the great powers of 19th century Europe and the early 20th century. The British Empire was the greatest empire, the largest empire in all of human history. The French had no shabby empire of their own. They were the great old powers of Europe. During World War II, France, of course, is pulverized by the Nazis very quickly in just a few months. Britain launches a heroic defense, but realizes they can't win the war on their own. And the U.S. obviously goes to assist the old world, as Churchill said. If the old world falls, the new world will come to save the old. That was one of his again famous speeches in the early days of the war, and that's in a sense what happened. The Americans came to help the British in their war effort, but Britain and France still viewed themselves as leading world powers in the aftermath of World War II. In 1956, they make this plan with Israel to go into Egypt, and the Israelis largely succeed in their military campaign. But the United States is furious that this actually happened. It threw off their whole Cold War calculations. Again, obviously, U.S. Policy in general in the post-World War II period was dominated by the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower writes to the leaders of France and Britain saying, you end this now. And it was the first time that an American president was dictating from a place of authority to France and and Britain, these great powers of whom America was their younger cousin, that he was dictating to them what they are going to do, and in no uncertain terms. And it was almost like in world history, it was almost like a turning point when everybody recognized, like, oh, the old world is over now. The old order is over now. There's a new chief in town. And it was the moment that the United States really put Britain and France into their place for their participation in this. But as much as that's what the world remembers, from an Israeli standpoint, it was actually a success in my mind, ethically and militarily. They did have great military success, and it did buy quiet on Israel's southern border. And then finally, there's the 1982 First Lebanon War, which Rabbi Brody identifies as Israel's greatest moral failure. But the reasons why he identifies it as Israel's greatest moral failure are very important to take into consideration in the broader ethical analysis. What was happening, as we said before, the PLO was entrenched in Lebanon. They had previously been in Jordan, but they were eliminated by, not Israel, by the Jordanian government in what's called Black September. The Jordanians realized that the Palestinians were not helping their society. They were just dragging it into a war with Israel, which Jordan did not want. So they brutally eliminate the Palestinians. No one bothers condemning Jordan for that. But they brutally eliminate the Palestinian leadership in Jordan, and they move to Lebanon, where they do the same thing in Lebanon. They start dragging Lebanon into a war with Israel. Israel decides at a certain point that they want to eliminate the PLO. In terms of our cost-benefit analysis of a preemptive strike, as we've been doing all along, the cost was an immense cost of Israeli lives. Ultimately, the Israeli military got bogged down in Lebanon, and there was a cost in Israel's international standing as well. In terms of the benefit, it did succeed in removing the PLO from Lebanon, but that potentially could have been done at a lesser price. And of course, we also know that the PLO was replaced in Lebanon. So now we don't have the PLO launching terror attacks from Lebanon. We have an organization called Hezbollah instead. So why was it a moral failure? So Rabbi Brody, and again, here I think the nuances are very, very important. He doesn't suggest that there was no right for Israel to go to war in Lebanon. Menachem Begin believed that they had a right to do so, and I think a fair-minded analysis would argue that they had a right to do so. Again, there will always be those who say that you cannot. I meant to mention before, but I'll throw this in now. I was speaking to one of my students who elected to go to NYU. This was years ago, before October 7th, and he elected to take a course in modern Middle East history. I said to him, "You're crazy! You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. You're going to get way over your head." And he says, "No, I'm going to defend Israel." And of course, he didn't know the first thing about contemporary post-colonial ideology and the whole skewed worldview. that is taught as dogma in many of these universities. He said after the first day he dropped the course. And one of the things he said to me was the 1967 war in that course was presented as a war of Israeli aggression. It was presented as a case where no one attacked Israel and Israel attacked its Arab neighbors. So again, in terms of, there will always be those who, no matter what Israel does, condemn Israel as an aggressor. In this case, Rabbi Brody does not. It was moral to go to war. What was immoral was the way they conducted the war in the following way. There were three options for what they could have done, he says. They could have just done deterrence. They could have just tried to deter the PLO. That wasn't really working. That wasn't really an option. They could have created a barrier, a security barrier in southern Lebanon. That would have been option number two. Or number three, they could have tried to eliminate the PLO entirely from Beirut. The problem was they didn't decide which one they were going to do. They could have done any of those, and any of them would have been a legitimate option. But they told the Israeli populace, including the civilian soldiers who were risking their lives for the Jewish people, that they were only going to do a small security strip in southern Lebanon, but really secretly their intent was to eliminate the PLO from Beirut. And dishonesty with your own soldiers, including also indecisiveness at the top, different military commanders having different conceptions of what you're going to do, throwing young men into a war when you don't necessarily have a clear conception of what you're doing, and they certainly don't have a clear conception of what you're doing, that is a major ethical failure. And it subsequently led to later ethical failures as well. He describes the whole, of course, Sabra and Shatila massacre, which was not conducted by Israelis, even though it is often portrayed that way. It was conducted by Christian allies of Israel, but Israel potentially could have stopped it. They did not. In other words, there was a moral morass because there was a failure of clear leadership, clarity of leadership, to dictate what this war was about, what its goals were, and what it was intended to achieve. I think he correctly notes that you can sometimes have a flux, as we saw in the original Gemara in Sota, between Milchemes Rishus and Milchemes Mitzvah. Sometimes something can start as a Milchemes Rishus, but becomes a Milchemes Mitzvah. Israel launches a strike that is only discretionary, but it provokes a response that is an existential threat. That's when a Milchemes Rishus becomes a Milchemes Mitzvah. A Milchemes Mitzvah can become a Milchemes Rishus. There's a threat, but once the threat is stopped, engaging the war further becomes a Milchemes Rishus. And there needs to be very clear leadership and very clear communication with the people who you are asking to put their lives on the line in order to achieve those military goals as to what exactly the military goal is and what exactly you are seeking to achieve. So you do have this, again, really remarkable history of preemptive strikes. And like I said, it continues till the current day. I think many feel in Israel that there will at some point be a war in the north. I think many feel that is a question of when, not a question of if. If for no other reason that the north is currently emptied of all of its civilians. So if they have a war in the north, they're going to have to empty everybody again, send everybody home just to make them refugees again is I think unlikely. So we need to daven hard this Elul. Sorry, and this Yom Noraim for what lies ahead. And we will see if there's ultimately some kind of preemptive strike, the type of which was discussed already in the early days on October 8th. That concludes our discussion of preemptive wars. Next week, we will talk about conduct during war. Once Israel has gone to war, either because of necessity or because of a preemptive strike, what are the rules governing war? This is what we frequently hear about in the press when they condemn Israel over and over and over again for the way Israel is conducting themselves. And again, we don't need to pay attention to that. We should not pay attention to that. But what is the Torah's standpoint on how one's conduct wars? Are there any halachos or broad hashkafic principles guiding how Israel conducts its wars? And how does that impact, or how does that play out in Israel's history and in a contemporary Israeli setting as well? That will, Be'ez Hashem, be our discussion for next week. Take questions. We have a few minutes until the 9 o'clock mark. Yeah.
In terms of the decision making about whether a war is to go to war is ethical or not, from the religious standpoint, is there a place for rabbis to have input?
Okay, so that's a very good question. It's a very good question, and the answer is somewhat difficult to give in a straightforward way. Let me start with Rav Soloveitchik's position, because that's, I guess, a natural starting point in our community. Rav Soloveitchik's position was that rabbis can always weigh in on broad halakhic issues, but when it comes to questions of, like, for example, like military efficacy of a certain tax, you need to consult the experts in any given field. So if I can give a mashal, if I can give an example, right? When it comes to certain medical halachic questions pertaining to, let's say, end of life, does the halacha have what to say? Of course it does. And like any area of halacha, there are also debates about what the halacha says. There are machlokos, there are debates among the poskim in every area of halacha. But any rabbi who kind of storms in there and says, I'm going to dictate what should be done and what shouldn't be done without consulting the physicians first, unless the rabbi himself is a physician, there are some of those as well, but without a full understanding from the geriatric specialist or whoever you may be dealing with, is engaging in malpractice. You can't make a decision without consulting the experts. So Rav Soloveitchik felt a similar thing, I think, about military affairs. There are ethical decisions to be made. That is the province and realm of the rabbinic leaders. But then every one of them has to rely on certain military realia, and there you consult the generals. You decide what to do. One area where Rav Soloveitchik made that decision, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more, is in the context of land for peace. Whereas some, where Rav Tzvi the cook, felt it was usher to compromise a single inch of land. That was not Rav Soloveitchik's position. Soloveitchik's position, Rav Ovadia Yosef's position, many of, and certainly this was the mainstream position among Haredi leaders as well, Rav Shach and others, felt that if indeed it is going to save lives, saving Jewish lives, pikuach nefesh, trumps kibush Eretz Yisrael, trumps, conquest of the land of Israel or retaining the land of Israel. We would give away land if it would indeed save Jewish lives. That's why, again, we're not going to get into this so much now, but the Oslo Accords only went through because of Rav Ovadia. The Shas MKs, again, I don't remember this, I was 3 years old at the time, but the Shas MKs abstained from the vote on the Oslo Accords because Rav Ovadia told them to abstain. He said, we're not voting for it, we're not voting against it. If the military experts indeed dictate that this will lead to peace, then we're not going to oppose it. Of course, later Rav Ovadia came to deeply regret that decision. Why? Because military experts or the diplomatic experts who told us that there was going to be peace ended up to be quite dramatically wrong. But he never retracted that fundamental position. In other words, if they were fundamentally right, he would have held that way. So that was an example where the Rav said, if you want my position on the issue, I'll tell you what the ethical hierarchy is. Jewish lives comes first, said Rav Soloveitchik. And again, that was against other poskim who did not hold that way. But the Rav held Jewish lives comes first. Now, is this going to save Jewish lives? Should the Israeli government do this? You got to talk to the experts to determine whether it's actually going to do so. So I think that is, in terms of the question of whether there's a rabbinic role in starting wars, I'd say that's the general idea. Now, that could be nuanced at times. Where's the line between those two things? It's not always so simple. But as a general rule, rabbis should, in theory, be leading rabbis. I'm not talking about, small fry like myself. The leading rabbis should be ethical voices that can guide the Jewish people in these kinds of decisions. But certainly it must be done in consultation with experts who can assess the military reality as well. Howard, you had a question? 2 minutes, yeah.
Well, I can comment the whole idea of individual rights versus the collective rights. So who trumps who? If it's a personal thing, I hate to get political. So with the hostages or the national interest, which is more important? Is it the individual or the
right? So that's again. So in terms of asking this, there's really a lot to discuss here. This is obviously a super sensitive issue, particularly this week. So I don't want to get into that. I don't think we put like individual versus tzibur. Obviously, if it's individual versus tzibur, I think there's not much of a calculation there. The tzibur comes first. But I don't think this issue of the hostages can be broken down to yachid versus tzibur. If you understand the contemporary Israeli psyche, and again, I do not want to weigh into this. I definitely don't want to weigh into this week. And I'd imagine, based on the way you framed the question, that my view is probably quite similar to yours. But I think it's important to understand what the other view is. And the other view is not that we prioritize individuals over the collective. It is not. It is that it is extraordinarily important for the collective that we bring them home. And there's yesh bazeh mashu. There's what to be discussed there. So it's a painful question. It's again, like I said, this week it's particularly extraordinarily painful. But I don't think it's yachid versus tzibur. I don't think that's what the calculus is.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, Chevra. We'll break now for Mariv. I'll see you all next week. Bez Hashem.